Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Chamber Chatter, the podcast series from Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, in which we take a deeper look at some of the key business matters of the day, as well as some of the issues currently affecting businesses. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at a massive issue that sooner or later, in one way or another, affects or has an impact on all businesses. We're going to be looking at management and leadership and why it's becoming increasingly important right across the world of business. It's such a huge issue, we're actually going to split this particular episode into two parts. So to help tackle this, I'm joined by a couple of guests who are not just experts on this subject, but they've written books, they've taught management, they've held senior positions in recruitment firms, and probably forgotten more about this subject than most people will ever know. I'm pleased to welcome the Chamber's Chief Executive, Clive Memmott OBE, and Graham Whiley, Chair of Sage Green Consulting. Gentlemen, welcome to the Chamber Chatter podcast.
Thank you, Chris.
I've called this sort of management or leadership in the title. And I would just want to open up really with that question, because you know as well as I do, and we see it all the time, those two phrases just get interchanged, used in one way or another. Is there a difference? And if there is, what do you think that is? Clive?
Technically, there's a definition of difference, Chris.
Or Graham. Yeah, go on.
Management is defined the organisation of resources to produce outputs. So people, time, machines, whatever. And the better at producing those outputs and the fewer amount of resources you put in, typically you'd be judged a more efficient manager. And the ability to manage comes exclusively from authority. You're the boss. And so it's your responsibility to get stuff done. Leadership is something completely different. Leadership is the ability to create a vision that people buy into, a purpose, a goal, an objective, a direction of travel, a North Star, call it what you will, but something that people willingly want to follow you behind. And the point about that, there's no authority involved in that. It's entirely your ability to persuade. And in small businesses, in my experience, it's very difficult not to be responsible as the owner or the chief executive for both aspects. You've got to be a really good manager. You've got to know how to get the best out of people. And at the same time, it's got to be in the context of knowing where you're all going and then wanting to follow you. So technically, they are two different things. I'm really pleased you started with that, Chris, because you're right. The interchanging does tend to mean people get confused about the fact that it is fundamentally different.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Clive, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I have. I'll draw an analogy with our approach to economic success in this country, because if you take Graham's excellent definition of management, which is effectively about getting efficiency and increased efficiency out of resources, well, that's not how we've driven our labour market and our economy in this country over the last very many years, where of course a rich supply of labour has meant that we became lazy in terms of our productivity, and we can see the results of it now as there's an acute labour shortage in some parts of the market. So I couldn't miss that as an opportunity to throw that in. And I know we'll go back to the labour market. I mean, Graham's right, but the two things, of course, interlink all the time. And the problem is too many people then get themselves hung up about, am I managing, am I leading all the time? And you've got to know what the difference is. And this, as Graham says, leadership is about words like influence, motivation, empower, enable, make sure those people have the ability to succeed in whatever organisation it is, as opposed to that planning, power and control of management. But it's a great simplification of that. And again, this stuff gets knocked around in outrageous ways. Leaders inspire and praise, and managers find fault. It's not quite like that, is it? Leaders make change happen and managers react to change. Well, it doesn't always work like that, but they're important things to bear in mind. And, leaders, we make heroes. The managers all try to be heroes. And you get these incredible simplifications of what this thing is. But what I would say, the most important thing, in my opinion, and what Graham said, is that when you're managing things that are directly out of your own control, which is what real leadership is all about, it's very tricky, but I'll tell you what, it is the most satisfying and enjoyable part of leadership by a mile, and I love it. It frustrates me. I sometimes do it, really badly, but that's the stuff that really, really, really rings my bells, Chris.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, and of course, obviously, we've seen the leadership contest as it's going on at the present moment in time for the Conservative Party. We won't go down that particular route because we may come back to that and the point around what makes a good leader when you're the Prime Minister or not, as the case may be. But you mentioned something there around skills, Clive, and again, all three of us, we've seen it, haven't we, whereby you do surveys of business and what they need from skills. And leadership and management is becoming, one of those that comes out, quite near the top all the time. Is there a problem with that? Because surely people have to have a certain element of leadership already in there. Is it something you can actually learn? It's like management, how easy is it to learn those things? Is there a real problem? We hear it a lot from businesses, but is there a real problem with those lack of skills?
It's a really interesting question. I'm interested on Graham's take on this as well, because I go back, to that analogy with the current economic circumstances and the constant narrative. We have, our productivity in this country has systematically fallen since the financial crash of 2007, 2008. And the constant rhetoric is, we've got to teach our managers to manage. And then you say, well, what exactly do you think you mean by that? And what does it take to manage effectively in difficult environments? I mean, a lot of managers managing the current circumstances, war in the Ukraine, global supply crisis, still post-pandemic, all those, they've never experienced that in their working lives. So the idea that you somehow just kind of gather these skills as you go, of course, is wrong. And you do have to actually systematically look to yourself and say, where do I think I need to develop those skills? But it's not just simply a narrative of the government turning around to us and saying, our managers aren't as good as the managers in Germany, for example. I think that's absolute nonsense. But it's about being open-minded. It's about accepting that you can't, you're never going to control all the circumstances out there. And, spend most of your time influencing what you can influence, but also learn to live with uncertainty. Yeah. Most human beings like the notion of certainty, don't they? Yeah. Whether you're leading, whether you're managing or you're working as well, we like to think there's a degree of certainty in our lives, in our working lives. Sadly, that's no longer the case. And setting the environment where that can still be positive and enjoyable is probably one of the most important skills now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Greg?
When it comes to management as a skill set, you absolutely can learn it. You can learn it on the job, you can go on training courses, and people can give you tips and techniques, and your experience will grow. And it's definitely a skill that you can professionally develop. Leadership does at some point require a little spark. It requires a degree of creativity, imagination, desire, hunger, that you're not going to get out of a textbook, and a degree of charisma and all that other stuff. However, you can learn how the importance of leadership is in that blend of leadership and management. So you can definitely realize it's important. And if you're not the best person to do that in your team, you can perhaps seek others to blend the team to be what it should be. I was really interested in what you said, Clive, about productivity. Because you're right, we're in this huge transition now of labour shortage and what it means. But I've been a non-exec director for a Scandinavian business based in the UK for nearly 20 years now. And they've always had an entirely different view to the way in which they invest in their manufacturing business.
Yep.
But first of all, if they can get rid of someone in a business by investing in a machine, they will. And they don't look at it in terms of payback. They look in terms of, can I de-skill this thing? And they take a very long-term view of that. The second thing is they pay people disproportionately well. So they build that skill and they keep it. So they minimize the number of people that they require in their business, but they upskill them and give them a reason to be there and be part of something, which has always been unusual compared to what I've seen elsewhere in the UK manufacturing market, particularly in this instance is in the food industry. And the other aspect to that is, when I compare a number of the reasons why UK-based businesses wouldn't do that, they say, I need to stay flexible. If I make fixed capital investment, I could be writing it off if my market changes and so on. And the people from the Scandinavian business, just that never enters their head. If we're doing the right thing, making the right product as efficiently as possible, the rest will sort itself out. And it's a really interesting parallel in the sense of they've always thought like this. We're now probably going to spend another decade playing catch up, trying to find solutions to job shortages, which basically are going to, in many industries, in many sectors, are going to boil down to fixed asset investment.
I mean, if you look at that labour market availability post the financial crisis 2008, what was that fueled by? It was fueled by availability of migrant labour. It was fueled by people staying longer in the workplace. And it was fueled by getting more women into the workforce as well. So you have that huge supply of labour. And that was the thing, Graham, and that was driven. That was, again, driven also by government policy and government saying people take advantage of this. And, the investment incentives then didn't trump the availability of cheaper, lower productivity labour. And that has a huge scarring effect on that. And again, we get into a really interesting conversation here. That company that you're talking about will be privately owned. It won't be a listed company. It'll have long-term horizons, and then you perfectly described the Mittelstand in Germany, haven't you? Where you get that strong base of private companies. They can be very large, but they don't go public, and they'll have absolutely long-term horizons and investment horizons. And again, and one final comment I make on that, the super investment deduction that the government introduced at 130%, it was only available for capital equipment, wasn't it? Plant and capital equipment. And yet, a massive amount of our economy is service now in this country, where 46% of our exports are service. So why don't we incentivise that? And that is where you might see more investment actually in human beings as well, in service-based economies.
Okay, and that's leading us on to a little bit around, you mentioned there's some real changes in markets and the economic challenges. We mentioned it already at the start of this, where we are in a time period of one thing after another. It feels like, another week, another issue that comes out of the blue and really, hits people for six. We're obviously, you mentioned it already, I think, Clive, facing volatile economic and labour market challenges, the likes of which, few people have ever been through before. And we've also got, post-pandemic, this huge change in working practices as well. Obviously at the Chamber, we've gone on to a permanent 4-day week, haven't we? And things like that. So you've got all these things milling around there. If you're a manager, leader, both, how can you cope with some of these things that you're just getting constantly thrown at and thinking, right, okay, I've just got to look that a little bit in front now. This is what this is going to look like, because there's no rule book for what we're living through at the present moment in time. How much of this is sort of pulling from experience, and how much of it is foresight?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the job of the leaders and the managers of the managers, and where management fuses with leadership, is to help people, filter out the white noise. And of course, in smaller business, you haven't got large teams around you. You're often self-sufficient at senior levels of that level, and work out how the hell you do that yourself. And how do I concentrate on what's important? How do I make that decision when I'm being told that's what it's like to be? Inflation's going to be like this for a long time. This supply global supply chain situation isn't going to get. So I'm not going to make that capital investment, even though, as Graham, give you a perfect good example. That's probably exactly in many ways the right time to do it, because you'll reap the longer term rewards in those sectors. So I think it is difficult. I think the biggest one, Chris, the one that gets people, and I'm talking about the most, get asked to talk about the most, of course, is this horrible phrase that we must ban immediately, the new normal. Management was learned to manage in the new normal. And if you say that, you've actually got it wrong in the first place, because the whole point is there is no new normal. There has been a profound change in working practices, but of course, where does that settle? And of course, the truth is it settles in totally different ways, in different places and in different organisations. And that agility and fluidity of thought is very difficult. And you're reconciling, I want to get the labour I need, I'm going to be as flexibly minded as possible without undermining the consistency within the organisation. I'm interested in what Graham's got to say about this, because it's what
I think the situation is extreme on a number of levels, whether it's inflation, whether it's labour shortage, supply chain, political base, whatever word you want to use. There's a lot going on that we don't know how it's all going to pan out. But for your particular business, if you're a leader in a business, it's affecting you. All those factors are affecting you in very specific, very particular, very personal ways. Now, you're not being tarred with a general brush. If you have stuff made in China and you can't get it, that's your problem. If you've got problems with input inflation and you can't move the selling price, that's your problem. And so I think the first point is, don't assume that everybody's got all of these problems all at the same time, because I don't think they do. I think they have ones that hit them right between the eyes and they need to deal with them. And that is very personal, very particular. And within that, it's very often important to keep coming back to what we're trying to do here. Who are our customers? What we're trying to provide? What's the satisfaction? How are they feeling? What do they now need? Am I adapting to what is now the real world? And if you just take some of the silly examples from the pandemic, hospitality closed, but there were many, many restaurant businesses that pivoted to home delivery successfully. Now, that's never their original business. They would never have thought of doing it that way, but they've done it. And from now on, that'll always be part of their business, I guess. And you can think of a series of examples where the pandemic forced upon management and leaders to find a solution to that particular individual problem. So that's the first thing I'd say. I'd also like to think that most business owners, most business leaders have a degree of commitment that they'll find an answer. Creativity, determination, resolution, they'll find an answer. And I suppose my final point is one of inflation. I happen to be of a certain age, and I can remember when inflation was fairly routine and we all had an annual inflationary pay rise, and there was always an annual selling price increase. And we've had at least a decade or more of that not being the norm. And I think a number of the younger leaders in business now have been thoroughly thrown by the need to deal with price inflation, whether it's from wages, whether it's from material input prices or other service input prices, and they've not known how to react to that. And I think that has been a very severe challenge. And yet I can look around and see massive successes where people have either managed to dodge the bullet, that found ways of avoiding that increased cost, or they have successfully managed to re-engineer their pricing. I don't just mean put the price up, but re-engineer their pricing so their customers remain satisfied and they maintain profitability. So it is about understanding your particular problem as it's hitting you and your customer right here, right now.
And that's a really good example, I think, there of where the difference in management and leadership comes, because you mentioned there, Graham, about the pandemic and people saying, well, actually, we'll go to a delivery model for our restaurant. That takes a bit of leadership, doesn't it? And then the management bit of that is, right, well, how do we actually move this forward now? And this becomes a core part of the business. And it's a little bit like, you may think reacting to an inflation rate, that's not really leadership, but you've got to make that decision, haven't you? You've got to identify that opportunity and say, that's how we're going to do it. And then bring everyone along.
There's an element to this, Chris. Any form of significant change or variability in a business produces for the leaders potential risk, and it can be on a low scale or a big scale. And anything you do that isn't typical will come with a risk factor attached to it. So shoving your prices up might sound like a great idea, but you might not be selling very much thereafter. Going back to the pivot from being a restaurant to being essentially a dark kitchen with a home delivery system, that will have cost money. which might not have worked. And so it wouldn't have suited everybody, and in every cafe and restaurant wouldn't have been able to make that work. And so actually knowing that you're going to do this, being convinced that you can make it work, and then understanding and managing the risk that sits around it is part of that leadership management balance in an uncertain time.
I think the question then, Graham, is what you say there is correct, but often for the smaller business with less resources or leaders that managers that might feel slightly isolated, making those changes is extremely difficult, isn't it? And it's helping. And again, half the battle in this is to not behave yourself in the way that you're hardwired into behaving, because you've got to do that level of adaptation. And my last comment on what you said, I was surprised you used the word pivot twice, which is what our politicians use. And I would like to ban.
Pivot is now banned.
For goodness sake, don't say ecosystem. Anyway, I'm going to just move on to a quite a serious element now of managing people, and we're going to just start to look at issues around stress. And Graham, you come up with this phrase which I particularly like, around making misery optional, and stress, and is it up to the manager to be aware of that and work it out, or is it up to the employee? Is it a combination of the two? But stress is an inescapable fact of life for many, isn't it? And obviously, I mean, managers can obviously be stressed, but obviously you've got employees as well that you want to look at as well. What role? And again, what is the primary point of ownership, I suppose, really, of where, how do you manage stress out of the workforce? Is it a management responsibility? Is it a combination of management and the employee? Yes. Excellent.
I think there's an interesting backdrop to this. I think we now understand as a society that mental fitness is as important as physical fitness in being able to perform at work as well as in your private life. And I think the ability to promote mental fitness and conversations about mental fitness in the workplace have moved on enormously. Clearly the pandemic accelerated that, but it was happening before that. A bit like inflation, I go back far enough to remember when stress was something you never admitted to because it was very career negative. If you couldn't cope with stress, if you can't stand heat, get out of the kitchen, and all those kinds of very helpful remarks. And I think that the reality is that the conversation is now open. People are able to say, I'm not coping, or I've got a problem with this aspect. And it's right and proper that the discussion now takes place. And the responsibility for fixing it is primarily with the individual, obviously, but their employer has a massive impact on that. The way they behave, the way they treat them, the environment they create, all of that is totally and directly relevant to the pressures that the person is experiencing. Now, clearly, the way they respond to those pressures and pressures outside of work, which can be equally difficult and equally stress-inducing, are what will then end up with where they're able to cope with any sense of overwhelm or any sense of inability to cope or lack of confidence, call it what you will, that builds up and builds up and builds up. And so it's definitely a joint responsibility. To answer your initial question, the primary responsibility, I believe, sits with the individual to say, I've got a problem, seek help from wherever that is, their manager, their medical advisors, whoever, and then work their best way forward. And so I'm very pleased that we've moved into this space where it's absolutely open and ready for people to talk, and employers are beginning to accept it's a reality of life, and if they want to get the best out of their people, they need to come to the party.
Clive?
I think, I'd agree with that. Again, I think we have to contextualise it. There's still lots of organisations, big, small, multiple sectors, public sector, private sector, voluntary sector, where, stress-inducing behaviour is still very much alive and well. Let's not delude ourselves that it's not there. But if And we must be careful not to institutionalise this discussion, but I think it's been positive. And we've got to make sure that, again, management's got to be very certain here. Sometimes management really worries about, having a conversation around stress and mental health with people that work with them. And you've got to learn to become quite relaxed about that discussion as well, and know when to bring in professional help if that's relevant and if that's necessary. And that's the danger, you get to put in a box and seen as too big a thing. I mean, my own view at the start of the pandemic, we moved, as we know, Chris, to a 4-day working week for the staff, because we thought that was going to reflect what people wanted in the workplace going forward, and what those early lessons that were being learned, and all that is about a feeling of trying to satisfy the best interest, reconciling the best interest of the staff and the employee. And that, let's be honest, that's not always easy, but that's the discussion we're having. I think Graham's got a really good story to tell on this stuff, because, he was, we've known each other for a number of years. He's a very, clear-minded, clear thinker, very action-orientated, and he got involved in some really interesting work and became deeply aware of mental health issues. And that actually had quite a profound impact on me in some ways as well. It's because of one that I wasn't used to working with, having a very different view to how he goes about thinking and doing things. That's the sort of, role models that are important.
Yeah, in 2019, I got exposed to the work of a guy called Shazad Shamin, who's a Stanford lecturer based in California and a psychologist. And he's pulled together learning that many of us have seen before, but we've only ever seen piecemeal. And he's pulled it together as to a single operating system. And he's pulled it together and he's very cleverly put it on an app on a phone. And so it can show you the work shows you very quickly that the biggest influencer of stress on somebody is yourself. The way you respond to life's challenges dictates largely the outcome. And so if that is the case, you can choose your response. You can choose what the outcome is going to be. And one of the best ridiculous examples is road rage, isn't it? You're driving along nicely on your way to the office and someone cuts you up, and what you do next drives the rest of your day, really. So you flick a finger, you overtake them, you give them a dose of their own. Well, that's one outcome. Or you just turn the radio up, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the drive. And really, if you think about life's challenges in that way, if you can teach yourself to understand that you're putting yourself under stress, if you teach yourself to recognize all these negative thoughts going on in your head are coming from you and nobody else, then you can say, no, quieten down. I'm not listening to that. I'm going to see what's happening here through a lens of reality and practicality, and I'm going to choose my own response. And a lot of this is all to do with neuroscience. This is all to do with neural pathways that we've built up over decades of life, and they become our standard responses. And in many ways, they're from survival. That is what's kept us alive and got us through life so far. But they've got just a tad overgrown and a bit overworn, and we need to interrupt them and rebuild some new neural pathways to enable us to react differently to life's changes. And so this work is called Positive Intelligence. It's work, as I say, from Shazad Shamin, and it combines things like meditation, mindfulness, all of the neurosciences, and so on and so on and so on, into a very simple thing to understand, but quite a difficult thing to do, because essentially you're building new habits, and that takes about 6 weeks, as everybody knows, to build new neural pathways. So 2019, and we've rolled it out ourselves throughout our client base, and it's been immensely successful. So it's not about me saying, I think it's very good, I think it works. I know it does. But it doesn't mean that life isn't a challenge. It doesn't mean there aren't things you'd rather didn't happen. And it doesn't mean you're entirely in control of your life, because you're not. And there's no point living in some kind of delusional world. But it does bring you back to the point I was making earlier, which is ultimately the responsibility for managing stress, the primary responsibility for managing stress, must sit with the individual, because they're the only person who knows the whole picture of what is creating that damage to them. And an employer's only ever going to know it from one angle. And that may well not be the complete picture.
Yeah, I think that's true. Now. I mean, I'll try and give that an illustration in the day-to-day, because when we associate management, words associate power, control, planning, writing out the goals, that sort of thing. What you tend to get is quite transactional relationships if you're not careful. You might say, no, we're all friends at work, but actually you're behaving in a transactional way. And a huge amount of people in that situation, when they say that someone doesn't do what they ask or is unable to effectively do what they ask, they see it as an act of resistance. They absolutely see that as you are resisting what I want to do. And I absolutely guarantee anyone that listens to this down to that 90% of that is down to they actually don't understand fully what you want them to do in the first place. And more importantly, they don't feel confident to execute that either. And that's deeply linked up with what Graham's saying about this, changing the way you look at those things and having the confidence. And remember, that an empowered style of management that has more of these discussions. Well, okay, so you don't think you can do that. Let's look at other alternatives. That leaves a lot of self-confidence, and the managers and the leaders have got to find the self-confidence to do that as well.
There's no doubt the way managers approach challenges from their staff impacts the outcomes they're going to get.
Yeah.
The more skillful they are, the more understanding they are, the more empathetic they are, the more likely the better outcome. And we've all worked with managers that are just dictatorial. We've all worked with managers that are all pace setters, and they've got pretty much one management style fits all, my way or the highway, and all the things that we've heard many times. And that doesn't make them effective in the end. In the end, it makes them less effective. But let's not lose sight of the fact that sometimes people are incompetent, sometimes people are lazy, sometimes people lose sight of what they're supposed to be doing, sometimes they're not good time managers of their own time, and sometimes there are things that the person's responsible for too. So it's not all on the manager necessarily, but if you've got an empathetic manager, you've got someone who can open up to why is that a problem for you, you're halfway to finding the solution, which isn't.
The manager has got to reckon, the person in that position of authority has got to recognise what's going on there and understand that. And that still doesn't happen in a lot of instances.
No. Now, there are cultures, and I see them, I work in them. I see cultures where I'm the boss, I don't pay you to think, you're here to do what I say. And however ridiculous that might sound in 2022, unfortunately, it's true. Now, it's a disappointment, but I think it's, as a generalisation, that's not the norm.
I agree with you, Graham. And people just stay clear of things, saying like you're all empowered here, but when you really mean you're empowered to do what I say, because people see through all that sort of crap, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know when you're empowered, don't you? You don't need to be told.
Absolutely.
Note on the desk.
Yeah, I've not quite grasped the notion of this, have they?
That's excellent, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Comes to the end of the first part of this large episode on leadership and management, and we've covered a heck of a lot of ground in the last 30 minutes or so, which I thought we would do, and some real insights as well, and some very great practical examples as well, which is absolutely superb. So just going to round off part one here. Graham, Clive, thank you very much. In part two, we're going to be covering a whole range of other things as well. We're going to be looking at coaching and diversity as well. We may get back into this mental fitness bit as well, which I think is quite important. And again, one of those challenges we're hearing from managers and leaders more and more that they need some help with. So we may just touch back on this as well. But it's the end of part one. Graham, Clive, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll be back in part two.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Cheers.